He ate alone every Friday night for 3 years. Same corner table, same order, never spoke to anyone. The waitress thought he was just another lonely old man until she brought the check and his sleeve shifted. The tattoo on his forearm wasn't something you got at a parlor. It was something you earned in places that didn't exist on any map. This is the kind of story they don't teach in history books. Before we dive into this tale of hidden heroes and forgotten legends, tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching today? And if you believe these untold stories deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that matter, the ones that remind us that heroes walk among us every single day. Invisible until someone finally sees them. Mickey's Diner had been serving the same comfort food for 40 years. Red vinyl booths, checkered floor tiles, and a jukebox that still played songs from the 1980s. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee at 3 a.m. and families came for pancakes on Sunday mornings. Table 7. The corner booth with a view of the parking lot had become unofficially reserved every Friday evening. Not because management had set it aside, but because for 3 years running, the same man had claimed it exactly 6 p.m., and everyone had learned to work around his routine. The staff called him Mr. Franklin. That's what he'd written on the reservation slip the first time he'd come in, though he never made reservations anymore. He just showed up, nodded to whoever was working the hostess station, and walked straight to his table like he owned the place. He wasn't rude about it. He wasn't demanding. He was just present. The kind of presence that made people step aside without being asked, that commanded space without taking it by force. Franklin looked to be in his early 70s, though he moved like someone who had learned to ignore pain rather than avoid it. His hair was steel gray, cut military short, and his face carried lines that spoke of decisions made under pressure. He wore the same type of clothing every visit: dark jeans, work boots that had seen real work, and a navy blue button-down shirt that he kept rolled to his forearms. He always ordered the same meal: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and black coffee. No appetizer, no dessert, no variations. He ate slowly, methodically, like someone who had learned not to take food for granted. He never looked at his phone, never brought a book or newspaper. He just ate, thought, and watched the traffic through the window. The waitresses had learned his routine by heart. Diane, who worked Friday nights for 15 years, knew to bring his coffee immediately and his food within 10 minutes. He never complained about timing, never sent anything back, and always left a $20 tip on a $12 meal. He was a perfect customer, except for one thing. He never spoke beyond ordering. No small talk, no weather observations, no comments about the food. Just meatloaf plate, coffee black, thank you. Sarah Martinez started working Friday nights 6 months ago. Fresh out of high school, saving money for college, she found the routine customers easier to handle than the weekend crowd. Mr. Franklin was a favorite table because he was predictable, polite, and generous with tips. She tried making conversation a few times. "How's your evening going?" or "Looks like rain outside." But he would just nod politely and return to his meal. She'd given up trying after the 3rd week, deciding he simply preferred to eat in peace. That Friday started like any other. Franklin arrived at 5:58 p.m., walked to table 7, and settled into the booth facing the window. Sarah brought his coffee without being asked, took his standard order, and delivered his meal 10 minutes later. "Anything else I can get you, Mr. Franklin?" she asked, the same question she'd asked every Friday for 6 months. He shook his head slightly. "No, thank you." Sarah moved on to other tables, checking on families finishing dinner, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates. The dinner rush was winding down, and the restaurant was settling into its evening quiet. Around 7:15, she brought Franklin his check. He was finishing his coffee, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She set the receipt beside his empty plate and turned to leave. "Thank you," he said, Reaching for his wallet as he pulled out the cash, his sleeve rode up slightly, just a few inches, just enough to reveal the inside of his form. Sarah was turning away when something caught her eye. Not the movement, not the money, but the INK.at first glance. It looked like a standard military tattoo. Lots of older guys had them, but as her eyes focused, she realized this wasn't standard at all. The tattoo was faded but precise, professionally done in black ink that had grayed with age. It showed a skull wearing a green beret, crushed rifles beneath it, and numbers that made Sarah's breath catch. 68 to 72 MSG. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father had served in Iraq, her grandfather in Vietnam. She knew military terminology better than most teenagers. And she knew that MSG wasn't something you put on a t-shirt or bought at a surplus store. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The most classified unit of the Vietnam War. The men who didn't exist, doing missions that never happened, in countries America wasn't supposed to be fighting in. Her grandfather had mentioned SOG once, in whispers, after a few beers on Veterans Day. Those boys, he'd said, they went places we weren't supposed to go, did things we weren't supposed to do. Most of them didn't come home. The ones who did, they don't talk about it. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. This wasn't just any old veteran. This was someone from the shadows, from the operations that were too classified for history books, too dangerous for recognition. Franklin finished counting his money and looked up, ready to leave. That's when he caught Sarah staring at his form. For a moment, neither of them moved. His eyes met hers, and in that exchange, she saw something that made her throat tighten. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a quiet resignation, like someone who had been discovered carrying a burden he'd hoped to keep hidden. Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly and whispered, "My grandfather served in Vietnam." Franklin's expression didn't change, but he didn't pull his sleeve down either. A lot of men did, he said quietly. MSG, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me about them once. So they were the ones who never existed. Franklin studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he rolled his sleeve back down. Your grandfather was a smart man. Some things are better left unexamined. But Sarah couldn't let it go. Her grandfather had carried nightmares from Vietnam for 40 years, but he'd served with regular infantry, regular missions, regular enemies. This men had been part of something deeper, darker, more dangerous. What was it like? She asked. Knowing she was crossing a line but unable to stop herself, Franklin placed the $20 bill on the table, stood up slowly, and looked down at her. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer, might break the silence he'd carried for 50 years. Instead, he said, "Some questions are kinda left unasked." He walked toward the door, same steady pace he always used. But this time, Sarah followed him. "Mr. Franklin," she called softly. He stopped just before reaching the exit, turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for whatever you did over there, whatever you can't talk about. Thank you." Franklin's face softened slightly. He nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than words, then pushed through the door and disappeared into the night. Sarah stood there for several minutes, processing what had just happened. She thought about her grandfather's stories, about the missions he could discuss and the ones he couldn't, about the men who came home and the ones who didn't, about the difference between serving your country and serving in silence. The next Friday, Franklin didn't show up. Sarah waited, watching the door, checking the time. 6 p.m. came and went. So did 6:30. By 7 p.m., she was worried. By 8 p.m., she was asking other staff if they'd seen him. Maybe he found somewhere else to eat, suggested Mike, the cook. You did ask him about his tattoo. But Sarah knew it wasn't that simple. Franklin hadn't seemed angry or uncomfortable. He'd seemed tired. like someone who had carried a secret for so long that being discovered was almost a relief. The following Friday, Table 7 remained empty again, on a break. Sarah walked to the hostess station and asked to see the reservation book from 3 years ago, when Franklin first started coming in. She found his entry, Franklin, table for 1, 6 p.m. Fridays. But there was something else. A phone number written in different handwriting. Someone had added it later. Maybe one of the managers trying to contact him about something. Sarah stayed at the number for a long time before finally pulling out a phone. The call went straight to voicemail. No greeting, no name, just a beep. "Mr. Franklin," she said quietly, "this is Sarah from Mickey's Diner. I just wanted you to know that Table 7 is waiting for you whenever you're ready. And I won't ask any more questions. Some stories are meant to stay quiet. I understand that now." She hung up, went back to work, and didn't expect a response. But the next Friday, at 5:58 p.m., Franklin walked through the door. He nodded to the hostess, walked to Table 7, and sat down. When Sarah brought his coffee, she set it down without a word, no greeting beyond a smile. "Meatloaf plate?" she asked. "Please," he said. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Sarah." She looked back. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "What was his name?" "Robert Martinez. 1st Infantry Division, 69 to 70. Franklin nodded slowly. "I knew some 1st ID boys. Good men. He make it home okay?" "Physically, yes. But he had nightmares until the day he died." Franklin was quiet for a moment. "That's the price we all paid. Some of us just paid it in different currency." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "MACVSOG," Franklin said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear. "We did recon in places that weren't supposed to have Americans. Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam. Small teams, deep insertion, no support." He paused, staring out the window. "Most teams were 6 men. We went in with 12 and came out with 4. Did it 16 times over 4 years. By the end, I was the only one left from the original roster." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "How do you carry something like that?" Franklin looked at her directly for the first time since she'd noticed his tattoo. Very carefully and very quietly. Because the moment you let it break you is the moment you dishonor everyone who didn't make it home. He rolled up his sleeve then, showing her the full tattoo. The skull and rifles were just the beginning. Beneath them, in smaller script, were initials. Dozens of them. Names of teammates who had died in jungles whose names couldn't be spoken. "This isn't decoration," he said. "It's a memorial. Every Friday, I come here, I eat alone, and I remember them. Because if I don't, who will?" Sarah understood then why he sat alone, why he never spoke, why he came back to the same table week after week. He wasn't just eating dinner, he was holding a vigil. "Are you the only one left?" she asked. "From my unit?" "Yes." "From SOG overall?" He shrugged. "There may be 30 of us scattered across the country. Most don't even know the others are alive. We were trained to disappear, and we are good at it." That night, after Franklin left, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what he'd shared. She researched SOG online, finding fragments of declassified information, academic papers, and memoirs written by men brave enough to break their silence. The more she read, the more she understood why Franklin ate alone. The missions were so classified that even 50 years later, most details remained redacted. The casualty rate was staggering, the psychological cost immeasurable. These men had volunteered for missions where survival was unlikely, success was impossible to measure, and recognition was forbidden. They had served in absolute silence, carrying secrets that were too dangerous for democracy, too classified for therapy, too painful for ordinary conversation. Franklin wasn't just a regular customer. He was a living ghost, one of the last witnesses to operations that officially never happened, carrying the names and memories of teammates who had died in service of missions that couldn't be acknowledged. The following Friday, Sarah was ready. When Franklin arrived, she had prepared something special. Not just his usual meal, but a small card folded beside his plate. Inside, she had written simply, "Thank you for trusting me with their memory." Franklin read the card, looked up at her, and for the first time in 3 years, he smiled. From that night forward, their routine changed slightly. Franklin still ate alone, still ordered the same meal, still left the same generous tip. But occasionally, during quiet moments between other customers, Sarah would sit across from him for a minute or two, not to ask questions, not to hear war stories, but simply to share the silence, to help him carry the weight of remembering, to ensure that his weekly vigil for fallen teammates wasn't held in complete isolation. Because sometimes the most powerful way to honor the dead isn't with monuments or parades, but with the simple act of sitting quietly with someone who refuses to let them be forgotten. Franklin never told her their full stories, never described the missions or the failures or the friends who didn't come home. But every Friday, he would share a name, just a name, and maybe a detail. Tommy Rodriguez, he might say, loved his mother's tamales. Or Jim Watson, could navigate by stars alone. Small memories, human details, the kind of information that reminded Sarah that behind the classified operations and redacted files were real men with families and favorite foods and dreams that ended in unmarked graves. 6 months later, on a particularly cold Friday in February, Franklin didn't show up again. This time, Sarah wasn't worried. She was terrified. She called the number from the reservation book. No answer. She asked the other staff if anyone knew where he lived. No one did. Finally, she did something that felt like a violation, but also like a responsibility. She looked up Franklin in the local obituaries. She found him on the 3rd page of the newspaper's online archive, dated 2 days earlier. Franklin J. Morrison, age 74, passed away peacefully in his sleep. Survived by no known relatives. Private burial arrangements. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. No mention of M.A. Sevier. No reference to his service. No acknowledgement of the missions he'd completed or the teammates he'd lost. Just a quiet notice for a man who had lived and died in silence. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Franklin Morrison had been more than the brief obituary suggested. He had been a keeper of secrets, a guardian of memories, a man who had spent 50 years carrying the weight of operations that were too classified for recognition. That Friday, Sarah set up table 7 exactly as Franklin would have preferred. Coffee cup, silverware placement, napkin folded the way he liked it. She placed a single white carnation where his plate would have been and sat down in his booth for a moment. She thought about the names he had shared with her. Tommy Rodriguez, Jim Watson, Mike Chen, David Park, all the teammates who had died in jungles that didn't officially exist, fighting wars that weren't supposed to happen. Franklin had carried them for 50 years. Now, in some small way, Sarah would carry Franklin. She folded a piece of paper and slipped it under the carnation. On it, she had written the only thing that seemed appropriate. Dinner is served. All present and accounted for. Have you ever met someone who cared more than they showed? Someone whose silence spoke louder than words ever could? Someone who honored the dead by living quietly among the living? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us what city you're watching from. Because some stories aren't meant to entertain. They are meant to ensure that sacrifice is never forgotten, even when it can't be acknowledged. Sometimes the most important memorials aren't made of stone. They are made of memory, carried by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, like eating alone at the same table every week, remembering names the world was never supposed to know. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us keep these quiet honors alive. We'll see you in the next one. And remember, the next time you see someone sitting alone, eating quietly, consider the possibility that they might not be lonely. They might be keeping vigil. They might be the only person left who remembers.